Hey, welcome, Marius. How are you doing?
Doing all right, Vimal. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good. Appreciate you taking the time. Maybe if you want to kick off with a quick introduction of yourself, we can get into it. But today, we're really chatting about AI in the valuation space.
Sure. So I've been in commercial real estate valuation for 27 years now. I got my start all the way back in the day at Arthur Andersen. Had a long run at Cushman Wakefield. Had a couple of executive level roles at Cushman. I was the national leader of the tax and financial reporting practice. It was actually a group that I stood up all the way back in 2007. Along the way, had a few other executive level roles at Cushman, and it ended with I was the national technology and data strategy lead. So this was actually a role that I was offered actually after you and I started working together back in the day on a different technology initiative. And then that work led to an opportunity at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I'm now a partner in the financial markets and real estate practice, so FMRE for short. FMRE is a what's called like a specialties group at PwC, and we principally provide valuation support to our audit teams across all asset classes. So it's not just real estate; it's financial products, structured instruments, private equity investments. So it runs the gamut across the capital stack and across all sorts of investment types. But of course, my focus here in FMRE is on the RE side, the real estate side. And then specifically, I am leading a large digital transformation at PwC where we're building a new commercial real estate data model that's going to be the backbone for some machine learning applications in support of audit, and then also in support of valuation initiatives in instances where PwC is not an auditor.
And I know when you and I had started working together, AI wasn't a blip on a lot of people's radar. It was on yours. You were still at that point even talking about the machine learning side of
Yeah.
AI.
Yeah.
So, the question really is like, how are you seeing people integrate AI into real estate work, valuations? But maybe you could answer it from two folds. One, how are you seeing people integrate it back then when no one was talking about it and you were seeing a lens into it? And then how are
Yeah.
you seeing it now in the last like 2 to 3 years when explosion has happened?
Yeah, I mean there were starting to be kind of like discussions around AVMs back then. So what was this, like 2018-ish, something like that? I
Seven.
can't remember. Yeah, 2017, man. Yeah, so I was more kind of focused on like traditional machine learning. I mean, unless you were deep in the weeds, LLMs weren't a thing. Of course, there was research going on with it, but I was more focused on kind of traditional machine learning, anomaly detection, that sort of thing, like visions of doing comp selections, and of course now we're in this totally different world. To be honest, like the commercial real estate industry is definitely a laggard when it comes to AI adoption. It's definitely, it's there's really only small pockets here and there, and we have a lens into this at PwC because we have inbound calls from clients all the time asking about, hey, like what's everyone else doing with artificial intelligence, and then it usually starts with a discussion of, well, there's artificial intelligence, and then there's machine learning, which is a subset of that, and then of course there's like deep learning, which is a subset of that. So it kind of starts with a little bit of education, but the application is really, so far, there's still a lot of firms that are frankly just struggling on the data side of it, right? I mean, as you know, the industry is, for better or worse, we deal with just a ton of unstructured data, right? It comes to us in prominently PDF documents, highly formatted, fancy tables and graphics, and offering memos, and of course even just appraisal reports themselves. They take on all sorts of different formats, looks and feels. There isn't really consistency from one firm to the next. So just dealing with a massive amount of unstructured data is a huge challenge. And then just broadly speaking in the industry, the characteristics of real estate data, it makes for a super, super hard machine learning problem, right? Because, we've got heterogeneous and fractured markets, right? So we've got different geographies, different property classes, different qualities, uses, ages of property, and then there's all sorts of observation limiter. We've got issues with similarity, right? Like kind comps, challenges around geographic decay. So when I'm looking at an asset in, say, the Chicago market, maybe the further away I get from Chicago, the less comparable that asset is, but maybe not, right? And then there's like temporal decay. So this is just dealing with like the data becomes stale right? And so I've got maybe in one instance, I've got old data, but then in certain asset classes, I might have very infrequent transactions. It doesn't necessarily, like old data isn't necessarily bad data in our space, right? And then, there's detail limiters, right? The data tends to be really broad, but not necessarily deep. There's qualitative issues, right? So by that, I mean, what's an excellent class asset in, the suburbs of Minneapolis may not be excellent in downtown Chicago, right? So you've got these little like nuances, these differences in and how assets are perceived across geographies, and then there's a myriad of kind of like legal and privacy issues, confidentiality issues that we have to work with. That adds yet another layer of complexity when we're building these types of applications, like machine learning applications. And so it's an enormously challenging problem from like a machine learning perspective. And then if I could add one more thing on top of all of that, is like just this concept of how do we get data to reflect kind of like what we experience as humans when you walk down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, or you walk down, Broadway Street in Breckenridge, or Collins Avenue in Miami. These are all very, very different markets, right? And we have emotional reactions, like you can have like an intuitive reaction when you see a certain group of tenants together, right? Versus, maybe you see a different type of tenant and you have like an emotional response to like a neighborhood, right? Maybe you see the quality of like the store finishes, right? So like there isn't necessarily like data sets out there yet, right? I mean, there's some interesting stuff that's coming down, I think, with computer vision and that sort of thing. But, like a couple of blocks, as you know, right, in New York, a couple of blocks is a big difference, right? And so like finding those data assets that can delineate, well, that asset is 2 blocks over, or like in the world of residential real estate, right? Like that condo unit is, 15 floors higher and has a different view, right? And so like capturing that sort of stuff, it just makes machine learning a really, really complicated problem. And so that is what I've spent about the last 2 years of my time at PwC, has been A, building that data model, right? And then B is like going out and trying to find like what APIs can we plug into, like what data sets can we bring in that, maybe it isn't an exact representation of what we're looking for, but maybe it's like one derivative, like a proxy of something, right? Where you can say, well, that data isn't exactly what I'm looking for, but we have a hypothesis that it's, somewhat correlated to the thing that we are interested in, right? So it's been a really fun, challenging problem. So I think your other point, though, is like, how is it actually being used today, like real use cases? I mean, the narrative writing ability, right, is kind of one that I've seen. I've seen demos of different firms developing in-house capabilities around this, but, when we write a typical commercial real estate appraisal report for, students that maybe are not familiar, these are long documents. These are 150 to 200 page documents, and they're loaded with tables and long narrative kind of describing data. And of course, LLMs are excellent at this, right? So for example, in a typical report, you would see statistics about supply and demand, right? And there would be a table with data, and then there would be a narrative description of that. Well, guess what? Like that narrative description now can be largely automated, right? So we're seeing like bits like that where it's like, okay, I have this good structured data. Instead of me sitting down and manually typing this out, like the LLMs are getting really, really good at kind of like summarizing that data, and then of course just dealing with kind of like at the beginning of engagements, right? Usually there's some sort of data dump, right? I get a copy of a rent roll, and I get several years of historical financial statements, and you get copies of leases, and the models today, you can even use like Claude Code to do this, right? Of like analyze all these documents and give me a summary, or like look for discrepancies. Maybe you have an Excel file that has a rent roll, and then you have a bunch of copies of leases, and you want to spot check, like, is the rent roll, does it match what's in those leases, right? And these, the agents are really good at that sort of thing. So you can, very realistically shave, hours off of certain tasks, right? And that stuff builds up over. So that's kind of how we're seeing it used today. We're not quite at the point with AVMs like in the commercial space where you type in an address and you get a value like that future. And maybe we'll get there at some point, but the industry has to deal with this data problem, so we're not quite there yet. But like I said, summarizing documents, helping with some narrative, doing looking for discrepancies in data sets. We personally, like we at PwC, we've done a lot around doing appraisal reviews. doing agent, like multi-agent systems to facilitate a review of an appraisal, making sure that the appraisal is done in accordance with USPAP, the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice.
Does it fare well? So that's an interesting use case I've never heard. So actually having it do a validation on something that has defined standards.
Yeah.
Does the LLM actually nail that pretty well?
It does. So there's kind of like two levels of reviews, right? There's something called like an administrative review, which is, more just kind of checking for, certain compliance issues. It's like check the box type of thing, making sure like, does the report have a science certification, right? Just very kind of like simple stuff. And then there's like a technical review, and a technical review goes a layer beyond just like an administrative review, where in a technical review, for example, I might do a deep dive into the discounted cash flow model, and I'm going to look at, okay, what was the last 3 or 4 years of revenue and expenses? Does the projection make sense relative to what the historical performance is of that property? But also, does it make sense in light of the supply and demand situation in that market? Like, does the underlying demographics and the market environment, is there a story that supports like what the projection is showing? Or doing a deep dive into the comparable sale analysis, looking at the comps that were selected and making a call of like, are these actually good comparable transactions relative to the subject property? There's a lot of subjectivity around that, so of course it depends on some of your prompting, but then the secret sauce with this stuff is actually giving the agents like access to external data, right? So then we can actually start to do benchmarking, right? Where we say, okay, the appraisal report is selected, the appraiser has landed on a certain cap rate, and maybe they present a set of data to support their conclusion. Well, like part of our process, just our normal audit process, is we look for something called disconfirming evidence, right? Well, we'll go to alternative data sources and see like, is there anything that kind of maybe proves a different hypothesis? So we can do the same thing now, like agentically, right? Where we can go literally variable by variable, through that document and pull out hundreds of variables and do like a sensitivity test on it, right? And do it automatically. You take that process that maybe was a 6 or 8 hours of work, and you can compress that. Like our agents, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes for it to run through. And that's even with, we have a bunch of kind of like human in the loop stopping points where the application's actually showing you the data that's being pulled out, right? And it'll pause and it'll show you where it's coming from in the document. So we have a bunch of guardrails like in that process that's set up. I mean, at some point, it certainly would be feasible to just remove the human in the loop process and just let it run all the way to the end. But the tech is still, we're still working on it.
Yeah.
As there's just a lot of testing involved when you're dealing with like, these like probabilistic systems where you're not, it's not cell A1 and plus cell A2, it's not like that. You're like, well, like probably it's this, right? We still have to have a human in the loop.
Yeah. And valuations is like one of the most like complex parts of like data aggregation data. And then there's, like you mentioned, there's a huge subjective data sets, right? How you feel about the neighborhood and just what and the finishes and such. Computer vision is being sold as something that could help with that, but we're years away from this ever being a one shot. So human in the loop is going to be the path forward. But shaving off 10 hours to 7 hours is still a huge tangible gain.
Sure. Yeah. I will say like the computer vision stuff is actually super fascinating. There are some companies out there, that have done some really cool things, like particularly like in the multifamily space, right? For example, they're scraping the web like on a daily basis. They're looking at the images of like the insides of units, like, units for rent that are posted on various apartment building websites, and actually tracking the fit and finish of this unit. Has it's got marble countertops and stainless steel appliances, and they're asking $X per month, and this other one has some different type of finish and they're asking Y dollars per month. So and they're doing this at massive scale, like scraping like millions of units on a daily basis and like tracking like changes. A lot of that is, a big part of the training set is actually is computer vision there. You can start to answer questions like, if you owned an apartment building and you were contemplating swapping out one finish for another finish, and you could actually quantify like with actually some data, right? Saying, okay, like if I spend $100,000 to do this renovation, I think I'm going to get a 10% or 15% uplift in rent, right? So, we like as appraisers, like you could do that, but like that process was very manual, and now it can be done with machine learning. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and then I mean, we didn't even touch on like the micro and macroeconomics that affect stuff 5 years down the line that you need to price into valuations now.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just the amount of data you guys work with it is just unbelievable. And we talk about like LLMs like one-shotting answers. I feel like you one-shotted all of my questions
Yeah.
right off the bat. I had like this list of things to go through, and I think you touched on almost everything. So, maybe we could just quickly just wrap on, if you are, somebody new coming to the valuation space, or you're looking to sort of stay sort of top of line, like what is the one or two AI things you would recommend, getting into that's going to be the must-have?
So, I know like there's a lot of like talk about like, oh, like you don't need to know how to code anymore. And I mean, to be honest, like I was a finance guy, degree in finance, and a master's degree in accounting, but it's like I just, it took me like 7 different tries to learn like Python over the years. Struggled with it a lot. But I will say that like having that like underlying like foundation actually helps a ton. It's particularly when we're dealing with these like multi-agent like systems, of just having some familiarity with like how to think like a coder. Like I still forget the syntax, right? Like I sit down and like I look at like a blank screen in VS Code, and it's like, okay, I got to import some libraries and that sort of thing. But like, just like understanding like the concept of like loops and variables and like all that sort of thing is still super important. At PwC, like we are, we're leaning in really, really heavily into generative AI. We're making sure that like our associates all have the latest tools. We actually just did a breakout session with a group of our associates where we cleared their plate for an entire week, gave them access to Claude Code and like all the latest tools. We said, all right, like you guys have the entire week, go solve a problem, right? And we broke them out into pods, groups of 3 or 4 together. And that's the type of stuff that we're doing, right? And most of them had no coding background whatsoever, and they came out with some amazing ideas. And we even have clients that are interested in kind of like institutionalizing, right? So they more or less like vibe coded a solution, right? But there's actual like value with it. And it's like, okay, like you vibe coded that. Now let's like bring in someone with software development expertise and like kind of make sure we have the belts and suspenders around this idea. But this stuff resonates, way more, and I'm sure you see it as well. I mean, way more than like just like a static PowerPoint deck where you're flipping through slides. If you actually show up with a solution, right? So, I definitely encourage like, even if you're a finance, student, like you have no coding background, don't be afraid. I mean, it's literally never been easier to learn how to code, right? Back in the day, if you have questions, you'd go to Substack, or go to, some website and try and look through previously asked questions and see if it applies to like the problem that you're having. Now of course you can just interact with these tools with ChatGPT or Claude or whatever LLM you're using, and they're incredibly good at, if you want it to be a teacher, if you want to learn, you have like an amazing super skilled developer right at your disposal that will be kind to you and not yell at you
and patient. Yeah,
it will be patient with you. So I definitely, that's like my main advice is like, don't be afraid of this stuff. Like get familiar, go take some classes. There's a million courses out there
for free.
I mean, there's so much free content. I did some stuff through Coursera is kind of what finally broke through for me. I started with just, reading textbooks. I got a whole load of books behind me. I personally found that, I would read the textbook and then I would just forget it, a month later. But actually like going in and doing a course and like, being forced to write little programs and little loops and things like that really, really helped me out. So that would be my number one piece of advice is, don't just be so laser focused on finance or accounting, whatever it is. Definitely get comfortable with these tools that are out there.
Well, Marius, I appreciate you taking the time. I know you got a busy day here. So This was super helpful. It was really valuable for us. But yeah, thanks again for your time, and we'll
no problem.
chat soon.
Anytime. Yeah. So take care.
All right.